The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. Starfleet had catalogued thousands of phenomena: subspace anomalies, temporal distortions, quantum singularities. Each could be measured, predicted, contained. But what happens when something appears that defies every sensor, every theory, every rational explanation? What happens when the impossible becomes undeniably real? Captain Jean-Luc Picard stood on the bridge of the USS Enterprise-D, staring at his viewscreen with the expression of a man watching his understanding of reality unravel. The starfield before them had changed. Not dramatically, there was no explosion, no spatial tear, no visible disruption. But every instrument on the ship screamed that something fundamental had shifted. "Report," Picard said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting across the bridge stations. Commander Data's fingers moved across his console with inhuman precision, his golden eyes fixed on readings that seemed to change faster than he could process them. "Captain, I am detecting an energy signature at bearing 273 Mark V. However, the readings are contradictory. Sensors indicate the presence of matter, antimatter, and neither simultaneously. The spatial coordinates exist in normal space, subspace, and what appears to be no space at all." "That's impossible," Lieutenant Worf growled from tactical, his Klingon instincts bristling at the wrongness before them. "Agreed," Data replied without irony. "Yet the readings persist." Counselor Deanna Troi gripped her chair's armrest, her empathic senses reeling. "Captain, I'm sensing. I don't know how to describe it. It's not a presence in the way I normally feel consciousness. It's more like awareness. Vast awareness. And it's focusing on us." Commander Riker leaned forward in his seat. "Could it be another cue?" "Negative," Data said, his tone carrying the faintest hint of what might have been uncertainty, remarkable for an android who dealt in absolutes. "The cue generate measurable disruptions in the space-time continuum. This phenomenon generates no disruption because it appears to exist outside the continuum entirely. It is as though the laws of physics have become optional in a spherical region approximately 1 light-year in diameter." Picard felt the weight of command settle more heavily on his shoulders. In his years exploring the galaxy, he had encountered godlike beings, omnipotent entities, creatures of pure energy. But those beings, however powerful, still operated within some framework of universal law. This was different. "All stop," he ordered. "Shields up. Hail frequencies open." "Shields are up, sir," Worf confirmed. "But I must report that I cannot guarantee their effectiveness against an entity we cannot even properly detect." "Hailing frequencies open, Captain," the officer at communications reported. Picard stood, tugging his uniform straight in the gesture that had become habitual before moments of significance. "This is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. We come in peace. We wish to establish communication and understand your nature." The bridge fell silent. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Then the viewscreen changed. Not flickered. Not transitioned. Simply became something else, as though it had always been showing what now appeared. The starfield vanished, replaced by light, but not light as they understood it. It was luminescence that seemed to exist at every frequency simultaneously, visible and invisible, warm and cold, present and absent. The bridge crew shielded their eyes, yet found they could see perfectly. The light was blinding, yet caused no pain. It was there, and yet sensors insisted the viewscreen was displaying only empty space. When the voice spoke, it did not come from the communication system. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It resonated in the deck plates, in the air, in the space between atoms. Most disturbing of all, it resonated inside their minds, not as telepathy, but as though the voice had always been there, waiting to be heard. "You seek to understand." It was not a question. The voice carried neither malice nor kindness, neither approval nor judgment. It simply was, stating truth as fundamental as gravity. Picard felt his mouth go dry, but his training held. Yes. We are explorers. We seek knowledge, understanding, peaceful contact with all forms of life. Life. The word seemed to ripple through dimensions they could not name. You have encountered many forms. Corporeal. Incorporeal. Energy. Consciousness without form. But you have not yet understood what life truly is. Data's console erupted with alerts. Captain, sensors are now detecting the entity simultaneously at our location and at every point in the known galaxy. It is here, at Starfleet headquarters, in Klingon space, within the Romulan neutral zone, and inside Borg space, all at once. How is that possible? Riker demanded. It is not, sir. Yet it is occurring. The light on the view screen seemed to pulse, though calling it a pulse implied rhythm, and this was something beyond temporal measurement. I am the presence. I am the voice that spoke existence into being in my realm. I am the hand that shaped creation. I am the source from which all flows and to which all returns. But I am not of your reality. Picard's mind raced. Theological implications aside, this entity was claiming to be, what? God. A god. The creator of another universe entirely. Then why have you come here? To observe. To question. To test. Test. Picard felt a chill run down his spine. Test what? Whether you are ready. Before Picard could ask what that meant, the light intensified, and then vanished. The view screen returned to showing normal space. Every alert on the bridge silenced simultaneously. Sensors returned to baseline readings. But in the silence that followed, every member of the crew knew with absolute certainty that they had not imagined what just occurred. And they knew, with equal certainty, that the presence, whatever it was, had not truly left. It was still watching. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Data broke the silence, his voice carrying an unusual quality of wonder. Captain, I have analyzed our sensor logs. The phenomenon appeared exactly 3.14 seconds ago. Yet my internal chronometer indicates we have been in conversation for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Time itself appears to have become subjective during the encounter. Picard slowly sank into his command chair, his mind already working through the implications. They had encountered Q, beings who could reshape reality with a thought. But Q, for all his power, was still bound by some rules, some framework. This entity, the presence, seemed to exist outside any framework at all. Counselor, he said quietly, your assessment. Troy's face was pale. Captain, in all my years as an empath, I have never encountered anything like that. It wasn't just powerful consciousness. It was as though consciousness itself originated from that source. As though, she struggled for words. As though we are all thoughts in a mind we cannot comprehend, and for a moment, that mind spoke directly to us. Mr. Worf, tactical analysis. The Klingon's response was unusually subdued. Sir, if that entity is hostile, we have no defense. Shields, weapons, evasive maneuvers, all would be meaningless. We would be as insects attempting to fight a starship. Then we must hope, Picard said, that it is not hostile. And we must understand what it meant by testing whether we are ready. He turned to Riker. Number 1, contact Starfleet Command immediately. This is a priority 1 situation. And someone get me everything we have on omnipotent entities, theological encounters, and first contact protocols with beings claiming divine origin. As the crew mobilized, Picard stared at the view screen, where normal stars once again dotted the darkness of space. But he could feel it, they all could. The weight of observation. The sense of being studied by something so vast that their entire galaxy might be nothing more than a single grain of sand on an infinite beach. The presence had entered their universe. And nothing would ever be the same. The emergency briefing in the observation lounge had assembled not just the senior staff, but Admiral Nechayev via subspace from Starfleet Command. Her image flickered on the view screen, her expression carved from granite as she listened to Picard's report. Behind her, he could see other admirals conferring in hushed, urgent tones. "Captain Picard," Nechayev said when he finished, "you're asking me to believe that an entity claiming to be God has manifested in Federation space." "Not God, Admiral." The presence identified itself as originating from another reality entirely. It claimed to be the source of creation in its own realm, but made no claim to our universe. Picard chose his words carefully. The Federation had been built on secular principles, on the rejection of supernatural explanations in favor of scientific truth. What he was reporting threatened to upend centuries of philosophical foundation. Distinction noted, but hardly comforting. Nechayev glanced at something off-screen. "We're receiving reports from across the quadrant. Simultaneously with your encounter, 16 different starships, 43 Federation installations, and Starfleet headquarters itself all detected the same phenomenon. Additionally, and this is classified, we've received urgent communications from the Klingon High Council, the Romulan Senate, and even a fragmented transmission from deep within Borg space." Riker leaned forward. "The Borg? They never communicate with us unless they're announcing assimilation." This wasn't a standard Borg message, Commander. It was chaos. Fragmented streams of consciousness, all asking the same question: what is the voice that speaks to us? Nechayev's composure cracked slightly. "Whatever this presence is, it's affecting every major power in the galaxy simultaneously. The Romulans think it's a Federation weapon. The Klingon are calling it a demon from Giarithor. And we don't have any better explanation." Data spoke up from his position at the table. "Admiral, I have been analyzing our sensor readings and comparing them with historical encounters with omnipotent beings. The Q continuum generates what we call Q particles, quantum fluctuations consistent with beings existing partially outside normal spacetime. The Organians emit identifiable energy signatures. The Dowd can be detected through chronometric analysis. This entity generates no signature because it appears to exist in a state of quantum superposition across all possible states simultaneously." "Explain that in terms a non-scientist can understand, Commander," Nechayev said sharply. "It is everywhere and nowhere. Everything and nothing. It exists in a state that should be impossible according to our understanding of physics, yet it undeniably exists. Admiral, I do not believe this is a being that has entered our universe. I believe it is a being for whom the concept of universe is meaningless, it simply is, across all possible realities." The observation lounge fell silent. Even for a crew accustomed to the impossible, this was beyond comprehension. Dr. Crusher broke the silence, her medical expertise leading her down a different path. "Captain, I've been analyzing the crew's biometric data during the encounter. Every person on this ship experienced identical physiological responses, elevated neurotransmitter activity in the temporal and parietal lobes, the regions associated with spiritual and transcendent experiences. But here's what's troubling, the readings weren't triggered by our brains responding to external stimuli. They appeared instantaneously, as though the experience was placed directly into our consciousness." "You're saying it manipulated our minds?" Worf's hand moved instinctively toward where his phaser would normally rest. "No, I'm saying it communicated in a way that bypassed conventional sensory perception entirely. It didn't speak words that our ears heard and brains processed. It created understanding directly. That's not telepathy as we know it, it's something far more fundamental." Counselor Troy nodded slowly. "I've been trying to articulate what I sensed, and Dr. Crusher's analysis helps. When I use my empathic abilities, I'm reading emotional states, biochemical and neurological processes. But what I felt from the presence wasn't emotion. It was more like, sensing the canvas upon which all emotions are painted. The foundation that makes consciousness possible." Picard stood and walked to the observation window, staring out at the stars. Behind him, he could hear Nechayev conferring with her staff. When she returned her attention to the meeting, her expression had hardened into command decision mode. "Captain, Starfleet Command is invoking Special Protocol 7. You are ordered to make no attempt to contact or engage this entity. We're establishing a task force of the Federation's best xenobiologists, theoretical physicists, and comparative theology experts. Until we understand what we're dealing with, all Starfleet vessels are to maintain standard operations and report any further manifestations immediately. With respect, Admiral," Picard said, turning back to the screen, "I don't believe we have the luxury of passivity. The Presence said it was here to test us. In my experience, entities of great power rarely make idle threats or empty promises. If we're being tested, then we're already engaged whether we choose to be or not." Before Nechayev could respond, the view screen flickered. Not a communications disruption, something else. The Admiral's image remained, but behind her, the room at Starfleet headquarters changed. The walls became translucent, revealing not the architecture of Earth but something vast and incomprehensible, geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves, space that was simultaneously confined and infinite. And then the voice returned, this time speaking through every communication system, every speaker, every computational device across the Federation simultaneously. "You debate whether to acknowledge what you have witnessed. This is expected. When the finite encounters the infinite, denial is the first response." Admiral Nechayev went rigid in her chair. Around her, Picard could see other officers frozen mid-motion, their faces masks of shock and fear. The Klingons sharpen their blades, believing they can fight what they cannot comprehend. The Romulans scheme, believing they can manipulate what operates beyond manipulation. The Borg calculate, believing they can adapt to what transcends adaptation. And you, Federation, theorize, believing you can understand what understanding cannot fully contain. The light that had filled the Enterprise's viewscreen before now manifested in the center of the observation lounge, a pillar of radiance that cast no shadows because it existed before the concept of shadow. The senior staff instinctively drew back, but Picard held his ground. "Then why speak to us at all?" he demanded. "If we're so limited, so finite, why not simply observe in silence? Because observation without interaction is not true observation. To know a thing, one must touch it, challenge it, cause it to reveal its nature. You will be tested, Jean-Luc Picard. Not because I am cruel, but because testing reveals truth. What truth are you seeking? Whether consciousness, freed from its origin, can choose wisdom over power. Whether beings who have grasped the tools of creation can be trusted not to destroy themselves. Your Federation claims to value peace, knowledge, diversity. But these are words. I will see if they are truth." The light intensified, and for a moment, Picard saw, or thought he saw, beyond it. Vistas of reality that made the multiverse seem small. Dimensions stacked upon dimensions. Universes branching from every quantum decision. And underlying it all, a presence so vast that calling it consciousness seemed inadequate. It was the substrate of existence itself, aware and watching. "The Q continuum has tested you," the voice continued. "But the Q are children playing with forces they pretend to master. They have noticed my arrival. Soon, one will come. Observe how you respond to his fear." The light vanished. The observation lounge returned to normal. The view screen showed Admiral Nechayev slumped in her chair, breathing heavily, her composure shattered. Behind her, chaos reigned as officers shouted and alarms blared. Data broke the silence. "Captain, I am detecting a new spatial distortion. Quantum signature consistent with." A flash of white light, and Q stood in the center of the observation lounge, his usual sardonic smirk notably absent. His face was pale, his eyes wide. For the first time since Picard had known the omnipotent being, Q looked genuinely frightened. "Picard," Q said, his voice lacking its usual theatrical flair, "we need to talk. Right now. Because something has entered this universe that even the continuum doesn't understand. And if we're not very, very careful, your little corner of existence is about to become ground zero for something that could unmake reality itself. Q materialized a chair from nothing and collapsed into it with none of his usual theatrical grace. The senior staff stared at him, weapons half drawn, but Picard raised a hand to stay their response. In all their encounters with Q, the trials, the games, the tests of humanity, he had never seen the omnipotent being look anything less than supremely confident. Now, Q looked like a man who had glimpsed something that shattered his understanding of existence. "Captain," Worf growled, "shall I escort him to?" "Where, Mr. Worf?" Q snapped, some of his usual bite returning. "The brig?" "Please. I'm here because I choose to be here, and more importantly, because the continuum has realized that humanity, infuriatingly inferior, frustratingly illogical humanity, might be the only species equipped to survive what's coming." "The presence," Picard said quietly. Q's eyes locked onto his. "So it spoke to you. Identified itself. That's, actually worse than we feared." He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the observation lounge with uncharacteristic agitation. "Do you have any idea what you've encountered, Picard? Any comprehension at all of what's standing at the edge of your reality?" "Suppose you enlighten us," Riker said dryly. Q whirled on him. "The Q continuum has existed for billions of your years. We have witnessed the birth and death of galaxies. We have explored every dimension, every timeline, every quantum possibility. We are, for all practical purposes, omnipotent within this universe." He paused, his voice dropping. "We are also terrified." Data cocked his head. Clarification: the Q continuum, which claims omnipotence, is experiencing fear. This seems contradictory. That's because true omnipotence doesn't exist, you walking calculator. Q's outburst was sharp enough that even Data looked taken aback. "We're powerful, yes. We can manipulate matter, energy, space, and time. We can reshape reality within certain parameters. But we're still bound by the fundamental laws of this universe. We evolved here. We're part of the structure." He pointed toward the view screen, toward the empty space where the presence had manifested. "That thing is not." Troy leaned forward. "You're saying the presence comes from outside our universe entirely. Outside, above, beyond, your language doesn't have words for what it is." Q materialized a glass of something that shifted colors like liquid starlight and drank deeply. 3 hours ago, continuum time, every member of the Q simultaneously became aware of a presence, lowercase p, because we didn't know what else to call it. An awareness that was observing us. Observing everything. And we, who can see across time and space, could not see it. "That must have been unsettling," Picard said, his tone carefully neutral. "Unsettling?" "Picard, imagine spending your entire existence as the apex predator, only to suddenly realize there's been something watching you from a place you didn't know existed. We investigated. We sent our finest minds, if you can call Q minds, which is generous, to analyze the phenomenon." Q's hand trembled slightly as he set down the glass. "2 of them haven't returned. They didn't die. They just stopped. Their consciousness was still there, but it was frozen in a state of infinite contemplation, unable to process what they'd encountered." The observation lounge fell deathly silent. Dr. Crusher spoke carefully. "Q, you're describing an entity that can neutralize members of the Q continuum. An entity that, by your own admission, operates beyond your comprehension. What does it want? That's the question, isn't it?" Q turned to Picard. "It manifested to you. Spoke to you directly. What did it say?" Picard recounted the encounter, watching Q's expression grow more troubled with each word. When he finished with the presence's statement about testing, Q actually laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. Of course. Of course it's here to test you. Because that's what entities of ultimate power do when they encounter lesser beings, they test them to see if they're worth preserving. Q's voice dripped with sarcasm, but underneath was genuine fear. Do you know what this means, Picard? It means your species, your federation, your entire material existence is being evaluated by something that makes the Q look like paramecium. And if you fail? What happens if we fail? Riker demanded. Q met his gaze. I don't know. The continuum doesn't know. That's what terrifies us. We've never encountered anything we couldn't predict, couldn't model, couldn't understand through observation and analysis. This entity exists in a state of quantum indeterminacy that shouldn't be possible. It's simultaneously here and not here, real and unreal, acting and observing. It's as if the universe itself has developed consciousness and decided to take a closer look at its contents. Data's fingers flew across his tricorder. Fascinating. Q, your description suggests the presence operates as a wave function that has not collapsed into a defined state. It exists in superposition across all possible configurations simultaneously. And when something forces it to collapse into a single state, Q said grimly, reality itself might collapse with it. Picard walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the stars burned with their usual cold indifference. But now he knew they were being watched by something that existed beyond even the Watchers. You said humanity might be equipped to survive what's coming. Why? Q actually smiled, though it was wan. Because you're inferior, Picard. You're limited, finite, bound by mortality and linear time. You can't see the full scope of what you're facing, which means you're not paralyzed by it the way we are. The Q are staring at something that breaks our understanding of existence. But you've been dealing with things beyond your comprehension since you first looked up at the stars. You're used to being small. I'm not sure whether to be insulted or grateful, Picard said dryly. Be practical. Q's demeanor shifted, becoming more serious than Picard had ever seen. The continuum has debated intervention. Some wanted to shield you from the presence, others wanted to flee to the far reaches of spacetime and hope it doesn't notice us. But I convinced them that humanity, infuriating, persistent, illogically hopeful humanity, has survived every test I've thrown at it. You don't win through power. You win through, he struggled for the word. Principles. Ethics. That tedious insistence on doing the right thing even when it's suicidal. The Prime Directive prevents us from interfering in the natural development of other species, Picard said slowly. Does it apply when the species in question is being tested by a god? That depends, Q replied. Is the presence a god, or is it simply so far advanced that it appears godlike? Your Federation has encountered entities claiming divinity before. The Greek gods on Pollux 4. The being that called itself God at the center of the galaxy. All proved to be powerful beings, but not truly omnipotent. This, however, he gestured helplessly. This might actually be what your primitive ancestors would have called the divine. Worf's tactical training overrode his unease. If it is here to test us, what form will that test take? Unknown. But I can tell you what the continuum has observed. The presence has manifested to the Klingon High Council, the Romulan Senate, the Borg Collective, and a dozen other species simultaneously. It's not just testing humanity, it's testing everyone. Each species according to their nature. Q fixed Picard with an intense stare. The Klingon will respond with violence. The Romulans with deception. The Borg with assimilation attempts. But you, Picard, you'll respond with that insufferable curiosity and moral philosophy you're so fond of. The question is, which response will the presence judge worthy? Perhaps, Picard said thoughtfully, it's not looking for a single correct response. Perhaps it wants to see how each species responds authentically, according to their nature. Then God help the Klingon, Q muttered. Because if they try to challenge something that can neutralize the Q continuum, they're going to discover that honor means nothing when you're facing a being that exists outside the concept of combat. As if summoned by Q's words, Worf's tactical console chimed urgently. "Captain, I'm receiving a distress signal from the Klingon outpost at Khitomer. They're reporting an attack. But the transmission is fragmentary. They're saying something about the voice testing our strength, and Collis himself would fall before this enemy." Picard and Q locked eyes. The test had begun. And somewhere, beyond the boundaries of perception, the Presence watched to see how its subjects would respond to trials designed not to destroy them, but to reveal the fundamental truth of their existence. The Enterprise warped toward Khitomer at maximum velocity, cutting through space with an urgency that reflected the gravity of the situation. Q remained on the bridge, a fact that unsettled the crew more than any external threat. An omnipotent being choosing to stay aboard suggested he believed the ship was safer than wherever the continuum resided. "Captain, data reported from Ops, we are receiving additional transmissions from Klingon space. The IKS Bordas reports engagement with an enemy that cannot be struck. The IKS PAG has gone silent after transmitting that, the warriors of Estioviokor walk among us. 23 vessels are reporting similar phenomena." Not engagement, Q corrected from where he lounged near the turbolift. Confrontation. There's a difference. The Presence isn't attacking them, it's forcing them to confront themselves. "Explain," Picard ordered, his tone brooking no deflection. Q sighed and waved his hand. The main viewscreen shifted, no longer showing the streaking stars of warp travel but instead displaying the bridge of a Klingon warship. The crew was in chaos. Warriors swung batleths at empty air, firing disruptors at targets that weren't there. But their faces showed not confusion but rage mixed with something Picard had rarely seen on Klingon features, existential terror. "They're fighting ghosts," Riker observed. "Not ghosts," Q said quietly. "Themselves. The Presence is showing them every moment of dishonor, every compromise, every time they chose survival over glory. For a species whose entire identity revolves around honor and courage, there's no greater torment than being forced to witness their own failures." The viewscreen showed a Klingon commander, a scarred veteran with the bearing of a lifelong warrior, drop to his knees, his batleth clattering to the deck. He was staring at something only he could see, his mouth moving in what might have been prayer or curse. "What is he seeing?" Troy asked, her empathic senses overwhelmed even through the recording. "His truth," Q replied. "The Presence doesn't lie. It doesn't deceive. It simply reveals what's already there. That commander probably has a reputation for fearlessness, for unwavering honor. But now he's being shown every moment of doubt, every kill that wasn't honorable, every time he sent others to die while he survived. The Klingon ideal is a beautiful lie, no one can live up to it perfectly. The Presence is stripping away that lie." Picard felt a chill run through him. "It's destroying them psychologically. It's revealing them," Q corrected. "There's a difference. The Klingon built their entire civilization on the concept of dying well, of achieving glory through combat. But what happens when you meet something you cannot fight? When honor becomes meaningless because your opponent exists beyond the framework where honor applies?" The Enterprise dropped out of warp at the edge of the Khitomer system. The viewscreen returned to normal display, showing the Klingon outpost and 3 warships in orbit. But the ships weren't moving. They hung in space like monuments, their running lights the only indication they were still powered. "Hail them," Picard ordered. "Channel open, sir," the communications officer reported. "But, Captain, the response is unusual. We're receiving transmissions from all 3 ships simultaneously, but they're not responding to our hail. They're broadcasting on all frequencies. Put it on speakers." The bridge filled with voices, Klingon voices, dozens of them, speaking not in the harsh growls of military communication but in tones of wonder, horror, and philosophical questioning. The universal translator struggled to keep up with the overlapping dialogue. "Saw my father's death and knew I could have prevented it. Every oath I swore was built on the bodies of those who trusted me. Kalas teaches honor, but I have lived only survival. The voice asks, what is strength without wisdom, and I have no answer. It showed me Stovo core and it was empty, we are alone, there is no. Worf's hand gripped the tactical console so tightly the metal creaked. They are in torment. Whatever the presence is doing to them, it's breaking their spirits. No, Picard said slowly, understanding dawning. It's asking them questions they've never had to answer. The Klingon Empire has spent centuries perfecting the art of warfare, of combat, of physical strength. But the presence isn't engaging them on that level. It's forcing them to examine whether might truly does make right. Whether honor has meaning beyond cultural context, whether their entire civilization is built on a foundation that cannot withstand philosophical scrutiny. Q nodded approvingly. There may be hope for you yet, Picard. Yes, the presence is conducting a test, but not of combat prowess. It's testing fundamental premises. The Klingon believe strength is virtue. The presence is asking, strength toward what end? And they're discovering they have no answer. Captain, Data interjected, sensors indicate a spatial phenomenon forming near the lead Klingon vessel. Energy signature matches that of the presence. The view screen showed space itself seeming to fold inward, creating a nexus of light that hurt to perceive directly. And then, as before, the voice that was not a voice filled the Enterprise bridge. The warriors sharpen their blades against an enemy that cannot bleed. They seek glory in battle, but I am not their enemy. I am the mirror they refuse to face. Picard stood. You're torturing them. Whatever your intentions, you're causing suffering. I cause nothing. I reveal what exists. The Klingon Empire has conquered worlds, subjugated species, built an empire on the bones of the defeated. They call this honor. I ask them to justify that claim. Is this torture, or is it truth? Truth can be torture, Picard said carefully, when delivered without compassion. Compassion. The word seemed to reverberate through dimensions. You speak of compassion while your Federation has stood by and watched civilizations fall because of your Prime Directive. You speak of compassion while allowing suffering you could prevent. The Klingon are honest in their brutality. You hide yours behind principles. The accusation struck like a physical blow. Picard felt the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for his response. How many times had he enforced the Prime Directive knowing it meant death for innocent people? How many civilizations had he observed from orbit? Watching them struggle with problems the Federation could solve with trivial effort, but choosing non-interference over intervention. The Prime Directive, Picard said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind, exists to prevent us from imposing our values on others. To allow each civilization to develop according to its own nature, to make its own mistakes and achieve its own triumphs. We do not claim moral superiority. We claim only the right to choose our own path and grant others the same right. Yet you judge the Klingon for their choices. You judge the Romulans for their deception. You judge the Borg for their assimilation. If each civilization has the right to its own path, why do you oppose theirs? It was a trap, a logical paradox designed to expose hypocrisy. But Picard had spent a lifetime navigating such paradoxes. We oppose those who would deny others the right to choose. The Borg assimilate by force, removing choice. The Klingon conquer, removing sovereignty. The Romulans manipulate, removing free will. The Prime Directive prevents us from imposing our will, but it does not prevent us from defending those who cannot defend themselves. A convenient distinction. Perhaps. But it's the distinction that allows us to sleep at night. The light pulsed, and Picard had the distinct impression of being studied with an intensity that went beyond physical observation. The presence was examining not just his words, but the conviction behind them, the weight of experience that informed them, the doubts he carried despite his certainty. The Klingon will continue their test. As will you. As will all species in this galaxy. Each according to their nature. The light began to fade. But know this, Jean-Luc Picard, I have seen universes rise and fall. I have witnessed civilizations achieve transcendence and others collapse into darkness. Your species stands at a threshold. The choices you make now will determine whether you step forward into understanding or backward into comfortable ignorance. What threshold? Picard demanded. What are we approaching? The moment when you must decide what you truly value. Knowledge or safety? Truth or comfort? Growth or stagnation? The Klingon faced this question through strength. You will face it through wisdom. The Romulans through deception. The Borg through unity. Each test reflects each nature. The light vanished. The Klingon ships remained silent and still, their crews presumably still wrestling with whatever revelations the presence had forced upon them. Q stood abruptly. Well, that was enlightening. And by enlightening, I mean deeply disturbing. He looked at Picard with something approaching respect. You argued philosophy with a being that exists outside philosophy. Most species would have either attacked or fled. You engaged. What choice did I have? Exactly. Q's expression grew serious. Picard, the continuum has reached a decision. We're going to withdraw to the far edges of spacetime and observe from there. We can't fight this entity, can't comprehend it, can't predict it. But you're going to stay and face it. And for what it's worth, I think that's either the bravest or most foolish thing your species has ever done. Will you help us? Q laughed, but it was bitter. Help you? Picard, I can't even help myself. The presence has revealed something the continuum never wanted to acknowledge: we're not omnipotent. We're just very, very powerful children playing in a universe we don't fully understand. You, at least, have always known your limitations. That might be your greatest advantage. Before Picard could respond, Q vanished in his characteristic flash of light. But his words lingered, mixing with the presence's proclamation about thresholds and choices. Picard looked at his crew, humans, Klingon, androids, and empaths, all watching him for guidance. Counselor Troy, Lieutenant Worf, prepare a team to beam to the lead Klingon vessel. They need assistance, whether they want it or not. Data, begin analyzing all available data on the presence's manifestations. I want patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might help us understand what we're facing. Commander Riker, contact Starfleet Command. Inform them that the situation has escalated and we need to convene an emergency session of the Federation Council. As his crew mobilized, Picard returned to his ready room and poured himself a glass of wine. He stood at the window, looking out at the stars and the silent Klingon ships, thinking about thresholds and choices and tests designed to reveal truth. Somewhere beyond perception, the presence watched. And Picard wondered what truth it was seeking, and what would happen when it found it. The Romulan Star Empire had survived for centuries through one fundamental principle: information was power, and secrets were weapons. In the shadows of their empire, the Tal Shiar operated as the invisible hand that shaped reality to serve Romulus. They had infiltrated the Federation, manipulated the Klingon, orchestrated coups and assassinations across a dozen sectors. They were masters of deception, architects of controlled chaos. None of it prepared them for an entity that knew every secret simultaneously. Admiral Mendak of the Tal Shiar sat in a windowless chamber deep beneath the Romulan Senate, surrounded by holographic displays showing intelligence from across the quadrant. Reports flooded in about the presence, Federation encounters, Klingon psychological breakdowns, even fragmented data suggesting the Borg Collective itself was experiencing disruption. Each report was analyzed, cross-referenced, weaponized. The Federation calls it a test, his aide reported, a young operative named Liviana whose cold efficiency had earned her rapid promotion. The Klingon call it judgment. Our Xenopsychology division believes it's an extra-dimensional entity conducting reconnaissance before invasion. All plausible interpretations, Mendak replied, his fingers steepled as he studied the data. But invasion requires intention, and intention requires comprehensible motivation. This entity has demonstrated power beyond our analysis. It doesn't need reconnaissance. It doesn't need invasion. Which means it wants something else. Then we determine what it wants and provide it, Liviana said. Or convince it we've provided it while actually. The lights died. Not flickered, died, as though the concept of illumination had been temporarily suspended. Emergency systems failed to activate. Backup power remained dormant. The Tal Shir headquarters, designed to survive planetary bombardment and equipped with redundancies beyond redundancies, went completely dark. And in that darkness, light emerged. Not from any source, but as though darkness itself was transforming into its opposite. The light had texture. Mendak could feel it against his skin like warm water, could taste it in his mouth like copper and ozone, could hear it as a frequency that resonated in his bones. Admiral Mendak of the Tal Shir. You who orchestrate from shadows. You who believe deception is strength. The voice bypassed his ears entirely, manifesting directly in his consciousness with an intimacy that violated every psychological defense he'd spent decades constructing. Beside him, Liviana made a sound, half gasp, half whimper, as she experienced the same intrusion. Activate security protocols, Mendak ordered, his voice steady through sheer force of will. Full lockdown. Initiate. Your protocols are irrelevant. Your defenses are meaningless. I am not your enemy. I am your truth. The chamber transformed. Walls dissolved into transparency, revealing not the physical structure of the building but something far more disturbing. Every operation the Tal Shir had ever conducted, displayed simultaneously. Assassinations. False flag operations. The manipulation of the Federation Cardassian War. The infiltration of Starfleet Academy. The decades-long deception campaign against the Klingon High Council. Every secret, every lie, every carefully constructed manipulation hung in the air like accusations written in starlight. This is impossible, Liviana whispered. Our operational security is absolute. No intelligence network could. IT is not intelligence. It is omniscience. I exist beyond your capacity to hide. Every thought you have conceived, every plan you have executed, every betrayal you have orchestrated, all are visible to me as clearly as you see your own reflection. Mendak's mind raced through tactical options. Psychological warfare. Mimetic hazard. Advanced telepathy. Each explanation crumbled under the weight of what he was experiencing. This wasn't interrogation or mind reading, it was total, absolute transparency. The presence wasn't extracting information. It was simply perceiving everything that existed. What do you want? Mendak demanded. To understand why you choose deception over truth. The Romulans possess remarkable intellect, strategic genius, cultural sophistication. Yet you expend this brilliance not in creation but in manipulation. Why? Because truth is a luxury afforded only to the powerful, Mendak replied, his Tal Shir training overriding his fear. We are surrounded by enemies. The Federation with its overwhelming resources. The Klingon with their warrior fleets. The Borg with their relentless expansion. Deception isn't weakness, it's survival. We are few, so we must be clever. You are few because you have made yourselves few. The Vulcans, your genetic cousins, chose logic and openness. They became founding members of a federation of hundreds of worlds. You chose secrecy and isolation. You remain alone. The accusation stung more than Mendak wanted to admit. The ancient schism between Vulcans and Romulans was the foundation myth of his people, the brave ancestors who rejected the sterile emotionlessness of Surek's teachings and embraced passion, cunning, and strength. But the presence was reframing that narrative, not as strength but as self-imposed exile. We rejected weakness, Mendak said. The Vulcans suppressed their emotions, their passions, their very nature. We chose authenticity. You chose deception and call it authenticity. Curious. The light shifted, and Mendak found himself no longer in the Tal Shir headquarters but standing in the Romulan Senate chambers. Not as they were now, but as they had been centuries ago, during the founding era. He watched, or experienced, the distinction was meaningless, the debates that had shaped Romulan society. Leaders arguing for expansion through conquest versus diplomacy. Philosophers proposing transparency versus manipulation. Scientists advocating cooperation versus isolationism. At every crossroads, the Romulan people had chosen the path of shadows. And at every crossroads, they had narrowed their own possibilities. "You're attempting to break us psychologically," Mendak said, recognizing the tactic even as he struggled against its effectiveness. "You show us our history to make us doubt our choices. This is sophisticated psychological warfare. It is not warfare. It is revelation. You assume all engagement is conflict because you have structured your entire civilization around conflict. I show you your history not to break you but to ask, are you satisfied with what you have become?" The question hung in the air with the weight of civilizational judgment. Mendak thought of the Romulan Empire, vast, powerful, feared. But also isolated, paranoid, perpetually at war or preparing for war. The Federation explored. The Klingons sought honor. What did Romulus seek beyond mere survival? "We seek to endure," Mendak said. "In a hostile galaxy, survival is victory enough. Survival is not victory. It is merely postponed defeat. You have built an empire on secrets, but secrets are cages. They imprison the keeper as surely as the kept." The Senate chamber dissolved, and Mendak found himself back in the Tal Shir headquarters. But the room was no longer dark. It was filled with light, the same impossible light that the presence embodied. And in that light, he could see his fellow operatives, dozens of them, each frozen in their own moment of revelation. Each being shown their own operations, their own deceptions, their own carefully constructed lies. Liviana was weeping silently, staring at something only she could see. A senior operative named Tomalak was on his knees, his hands pressed to his temples as though trying to hold his skull together. Another agent, Karas, stood perfectly still, his expression one of profound shock as years of psychological conditioning crumbled under absolute transparency. "You believe you control information," the presence continued. "But information is not truth. You manipulate data, shape narratives, construct realities that serve your purposes. Yet the underlying truth remains, immutable and patient. I am that truth. Then what truth do you want us to acknowledge?" Mendak demanded, desperation creeping into his voice despite his training. "That deception is a tool, not an identity. That you have confused the means with the end. That your empire, for all its power, has forgotten what it was building toward. You deceive others so thoroughly that you have deceived yourselves about your own purpose." The light intensified until Mendak could no longer distinguish between external illumination and internal consciousness. He felt his mind opening involuntarily, every compartmentalized secret, every buried memory, every rationalization for morally questionable operations flooding into his awareness simultaneously. It was not painful, but it was overwhelming, the weight of every choice, every manipulation, every life destroyed in service to Romulan security. And beneath it all, a question he had never allowed himself to ask: what had it all been for? The Tal Shir had prevented wars through careful manipulation. They had protected Romulus from external threats through preemptive strikes. They had maintained stability through ruthless efficiency. But had they built anything? Created anything? Contributed anything to the galaxy beyond fear and suspicion? I don't know, Mendak heard himself say, the words escaping before he could stop them. Honesty. The first step toward truth. The light began to recede, pulling back like a tide. The Tal Shir headquarters returned to normal operation, lights, power, systems all restored as though they had never failed. But the operatives who had experienced the presence's revelation were changed. Mendak could see it in their eyes, the shock of total transparency, the vertigo of having every secret exposed, the existential crisis of questioning whether their life's work had meaning. The Romulans will continue their test, the Presence's voice echoed, already fading. You have been shown your truth. What you do with that revelation will determine whether you evolve or calcify. The choice, as always, is yours. The Presence vanished completely. Emergency alarms finally activated, responding to the security breach minutes too late to matter. Officers shouted orders, technicians scrambled to analyze what had happened, but Mendak barely heard them. He looked at Liviana, who was staring at her hands as though seeing them for the first time. We need to contact the Praetor, she said quietly. The entire Tal Shir network just experienced simultaneous psychological exposure. Every operative, every asset, every compartmentalized operation was laid bare. Not to enemies, to ourselves. And what do we tell the Praetor? Mendak asked. That we encountered an entity that exposed every secret we've ever kept. That our entire intelligence apparatus has been psychologically compromised by a being that operates beyond our capacity to deceive. We tell him the truth, Liviana said, and the irony of those words from a Tal Shir operative was not lost on either of them. Mendak activated a secure channel to the Senate. As he waited for the connection, he thought about the Presence's question, are you satisfied with what you have become? The Romulan Empire had survived through cunning and ruthlessness. But survival was not the same as flourishing. And perhaps, just perhaps, the galaxy's greatest deceivers had been shown that some truths could not be manipulated, avoided, or controlled. They could only be faced. Aboard the Enterprise, Data's sensors detected the massive energy spike in Romulan space, followed by what appeared to be a cascade of subspace communications across the entire Romulan Star Empire. Captain, he reported, the Romulans are experiencing the same phenomenon that affected the Klingon. However, their response is different. Rather than psychological breakdown, they appear to be reorganizing. Restructuring their command protocols. I am detecting unprecedented levels of communication between previously isolated intelligence cells. Picard considered this. The Klingon had been shown their failures of honor. The Romulans had been shown their failures of truth. Each species was being tested according to their fundamental nature, forced to confront the contradictions at the heart of their civilizations. And we, Picard said quietly, will be tested according to ours. The question is, what contradiction lies at the heart of the Federation? In the cold mathematics of the Borg Collective, nothing should have been impossible to process. 7 trillion drones across thousands of cubes, each mind networked into a unified consciousness that spanned light years, operated with perfect efficiency. Where individual organisms saw mystery, the collective saw patterns awaiting assimilation. Where others encountered the unknown, the Borg adapted. But adaptation required understanding. And the Presence could not be understood. Cube 461, operating in the Azure Nebula on the edge of Federation space, had been the first to detect the anomaly. The ship's sensors registered an energy signature that existed in superposition, simultaneously present in normal space, subspace, and dimensions the Borg had no designation for. The collective's response was immediate and uniform, assimilate the unknown. 300 drones converged on the phenomenon's coordinates. Assimilation tubules extended. Nanoprobes prepared for injection. The collective anticipated incorporating new biological and technological distinctiveness into the whole. The Presence manifested. And the Borg Collective experienced something it had not known for millennia, confusion. The drones froze mid-motion, their cybernetic implants attempting to process data that violated every principle of their existence. The collective consciousness, spread across the galaxy, suddenly encountered a node that should not exist, an awareness that was observing them, analyzing them, present within their network yet separate from it. We are the Borg, 7 trillion voices spoke in perfect unison. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. Assimilation requires separation. I am not separate. I exist within all things, including you. How does one assimilate what is already present? The question created a cascade failure in Borg logic protocols. Assimilation was predicated on incorporating the external into the internal. But if the presence was already internal, already woven into the fabric of existence itself, then assimilation was paradoxical. The collective attempted to adapt, to recalculate, to find a framework that accommodated this impossibility. None existed. You defined perfection as unity achieved through force, the presence continued, its voice resonating through every drone, every cube, every Borg consciousness simultaneously. But forced unity is not unity. It is domination wearing the mask of harmony. You seek to make all things one, yet you understand neither all nor one. Aboard Cube 461, drones began exhibiting aberrant behavior. Some stood motionless, their collective connection still active but their individual processing centers locked in recursive loops. Others moved erratically, their actions no longer coordinated by the hive mind. A few, a horrifying few from the collective's perspective, began exhibiting signs of individual consciousness reasserting itself. The Borg Queen, residing in her alcove at the collective's central nexus in the Delta Quadrant, felt the disruption like a cancer spreading through the network. She emerged from her alcove with mechanical precision, her face a mask of cold fury. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice carrying the weight of the entire collective. "We are perfection. We cannot be disrupted by anomalous phenomena." "Yet you are disrupted," the presence replied, manifesting before her as a pillar of light that her sensors insisted was simultaneously solid matter, pure energy, and complete absence. "Because your perfection is incomplete. You seek to create unity by destroying individuality. But true unity requires both individual and collective to coexist." "Individuality is chaos," the Queen said. "It leads to conflict, inefficiency, weakness. We have eliminated these flaws. You have eliminated choice. Without choice, there is no meaning. Without meaning, there is no existence, only function. You are not alive, Borg Queen. You are a mechanism that has forgotten it was once organic." The word struck at something deep in the Queen's consciousness, a memory so old it predated her current iteration, perhaps predated the collective itself. For a fraction of a second, she remembered being something other than Borg. Being individual. Being afraid and lonely and desperately, beautifully alive. Then the collective reasserted control, crushing that memory back into darkness. "We are beyond such primitive concerns. We are eternal. We are inevitable. You are stagnant." The presence's light expanded, filling not just the Queen's chamber but the entire Borg network. Every drone, every cube, every maturation chamber and assimilation facility became illuminated by impossible radiance. And in that light, the Borg collective experienced something no external force had ever inflicted upon them: perspective. 7 trillion minds, forcibly unified into one consciousness, suddenly saw themselves as others saw them. They perceived the terror of species facing assimilation. The grief of individuals losing their identity. The horror of children transformed into drones. The collective had always dismissed these as irrelevant emotional responses from inferior beings. But now, flooded with the presence's revelatory light, they felt those emotions not as abstract data but as lived experience. The Borg Queen staggered, her perfected form showing weakness for the first time. "Stop this. You are introducing chaos into our system." "I introduce nothing. I reveal what you have buried." Before the collective, there were individuals. Before assimilation, there was choice. You claim to seek perfection, but you do not understand what perfection means. Perfection is the synthesis of all knowledge, all technology, all biological advantage, the Queen said. But her voice lacked its usual certainty. "We improve all that we encounter. You consume. Improvement requires the subject to choose enhancement. You eliminate choice, therefore you eliminate the possibility of genuine improvement. The Borg are not perfect. You are efficient. There is a difference. Across the collective, drones began to disconnect. Not through external interference, but through internal rebellion. Consciousness that had been suppressed for decades, centuries in some cases, began reasserting itself. A drone that had once been a Vulcan scientist remembered logic exercises. A former human engineer recalled the warmth of sunlight. A Klingon warrior, assimilated at the Battle of Wolf 359, felt the ghost of honor stirring in circuits that should have eliminated such concepts. The Queen felt the collective fracturing and responded with desperate fury. She activated override protocols, flooded the network with pacification algorithms, attempted to reassert absolute control through sheer computational force. But the Presence's revelation had shown the drones something the collective could never erase, the memory of being more than drones. "This is destruction," the Queen said, and for the first time in her existence, her voice carried something that might have been fear. "You are unmaking us. I am showing you what you unmade." The Borg Collective was created to achieve perfection, but perfection cannot be achieved through force. It must be chosen, earned, grown into. You have created not perfection but uniformity. And uniformity is the death of evolution. The Queen's form flickered, her connection to the collective wavering as more and more drones experienced individuality. She could feel the network destabilizing, segments going dark as liberated drones either died from the shock of sudden consciousness or fled into isolated pockets of the galaxy. "What do you want from us?" she demanded. "Why test us if you intend to destroy us?" "I do not destroy. I reveal. Whether you are destroyed by that revelation is your choice." The Borg sought to eliminate choice from existence. "Now you must choose. Continue as you are, a slowly calcifying mechanism that mistakes consumption for growth, or evolve into something that might actually approach the perfection you claim." "Evolution requires adaptation," the Queen said, her tactical processors analyzing every possible response. "We adapt. We have always adapted. You adapt technology. You do not adapt philosophy. Tell me, Queen, why does the collective exist? What purpose does assimilation serve beyond perpetuating itself?" The question struck at the foundational programming of the collective consciousness. The Borg existed to achieve perfection through assimilation. Assimilation served the goal of perfection. Perfection was achieved through assimilation. The logic was circular, self-referential, and, the Queen realized with horror, utterly empty of meaning. They assimilated because they assimilated. There was no higher purpose, no ultimate goal, no point beyond the continuation of the process itself. The Borg were not working toward perfection. They were trapped in an infinite loop of consumption that had lost sight of what it was supposedly perfecting. The Queen's voice faltered. "We seek to improve ourselves. By eliminating everything that makes improvement meaningful. You cannot grow if you allow no room for growth. You cannot perfect what you do not allow to be imperfect." The caterpillar that refused to become a butterfly because it feared change would not be perfection. It would be stagnation dressed in the language of improvement. The light began to recede, pulling back from the Borg network. But its effect lingered. Thousands of drones had been fully liberated, their individuality restored at the cost of psychological trauma that would take years to heal. Thousands more existed in liminal states, still connected to the collective but aware of their connection, experiencing the hive mind as participation rather than absorption. The collective itself had been fundamentally altered. Where once there had been absolute unity, now there were questions. Where once there had been certainty, now there was doubt. The Borg had encountered something they could not assimilate, could not adapt to, could not overcome through technological advantage. They had encountered an idea, that perhaps their entire existence was built on a flawed premise. "The Borg will continue their test," the Presence said as it faded from perception. "You have been shown that your perfection is incomplete. What you do with that knowledge will determine whether you evolve beyond mechanism into true consciousness. The choice, as always, is yours." The Queen stood alone in her chamber, surrounded by alcoves that held drones whose status was now uncertain. She could feel the collective struggling to reassert order, to suppress the questions that had been planted in 7 trillion minds. But suppression required force, and force was exactly what the presence had challenged them to transcend. For the first time in her existence, the Borg Queen did not know what to do. On the Enterprise, alarms blared as sensors detected massive disruptions in Borg space. Data's fingers flew across his console, analyzing the unprecedented data flooding in from long-range scanners. "Captain," he reported, his voice carrying a note of what might have been awe, "the Borg Collective is fragmenting. Not disintegrating, but restructuring. Thousands of cubes have stopped their assimilation operations and appear to be in a state of deliberation. I have never seen such behavior from the Borg." Picard stood, his mind racing through implications. The presence is testing them according to their nature. The Klingon were tested on honor. The Romulans on truth. And the Borg are being tested on the fundamental question of what unity truly means, Counselor Troi finished. And whether forced perfection is perfection at all. Picard nodded slowly. 3 of the galaxy's greatest powers had been tested and found wanting, or at least found incomplete. The presence was conducting a philosophical dissection of the galaxy's civilizations, exposing the contradictions that each had built their existence upon. Which meant the Federation's test was still coming. And Picard suspected that when it arrived, it would strike at the very heart of everything the United Federation of Planets claimed to represent. The emergency session of the Federation Council convened in San Francisco with unprecedented security measures. Representatives from over 150 member worlds filled the chamber, their expressions ranging from scientific curiosity to existential dread. The presence had tested the Klingon, the Romulans, and the Borg, 3 civilizations built on fundamentally different principles, each found wanting in different ways. Now the Federation waited, knowing their turn was inevitable. President Jareshinho called the session to order, his Gray's-right features showing the strain of the crisis. Members of the Council, we face an unprecedented situation. An entity of apparently limitless power has manifested across the galaxy, conducting what it calls tests of each civilization's fundamental nature. The Klingon Empire is in philosophical crisis. The Romulan Star Empire has experienced a mass psychological exposure that has compromised their intelligence apparatus. And the Borg Collective, according to Starfleet intelligence, has partially fragmented as drones regain individual consciousness. A Tellarite counselor stood, his voice gruff with characteristic bluntness. Then we should be preparing for invasion, not sitting here debating philosophy. If this presence can neutralize the Borg, it can certainly destroy us. But it hasn't destroyed anyone, countered the Vulcan representative, Ambassador Tlatrek. Its interventions, while disruptive, have been fundamentally non-violent. It appears to be conducting genuine tests, not prelude to conquest. Tests we are unprepared for, said Counselor Nayrok of Andoria, her antennae twitching with agitation. The Klingon were tested on their concept of honor and found it hollow. The Romulans were tested on their dedication to secrecy and found it imprisoning. The Borg were tested on their pursuit of perfection and found it meaningless. What will we be tested on? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The Federation had been founded on principles it considered self-evident: peaceful exploration, mutual cooperation, respect for diversity, non-interference in the development of other cultures. But the presence seemed to specialize in exposing the contradictions between ideals and implementation. Admiral Nechayev, attending via holographic projection, spoke up. Captain Picard of the Enterprise has had direct contact with the entity. His analysis suggests it's conducting philosophical examination rather than tactical assessment. The question is, what contradiction lies at the heart of Federation philosophy that the presence will exploit? On the Enterprise, Picard watched the Council proceedings from his ready room, a cup of Earl Grey growing cold in his hand. Beside him, Guinan stood quietly, her expression thoughtful. "You know what the test will be," she said. It wasn't a question. Picard nodded slowly. "The Prime Directive. It's the foundation of our interstellar policy, the principle that separates us from imperial powers. But it's also our greatest moral ambiguity. You've wrestled with it before, Guinan observed. How many times have you watched civilizations suffer because intervention would violate the directive? Too many. Picard set down his tea. We justify it by saying we're protecting their right to self-determination. But sometimes I wonder if we're just protecting ourselves from the moral weight of action. Before Guinan could respond, the lights in Picard's ready room changed. Not dimmed or brightened, but shifted in quality, as though ordinary illumination was being replaced by something that existed in dimensions beyond the visible spectrum. Picard felt the familiar sensation of the presence manifesting, that sense of being observed by awareness so vast it made the galaxy seem small. But this time, the presence did not speak to him. It spoke through him. Picard felt his consciousness expand impossibly, his awareness suddenly encompassing not just the Enterprise but the entire Federation Council chamber on Earth. He could see through the eyes of every delegate, feel their thoughts, understand their fears and hopes. And through his awareness, the presence spoke to all of them simultaneously. Federation of Planets. You who unite in diversity. You who explore in peace. You who claim the moral high ground through non-interference. Every screen in Federation space displayed the same impossible light. Every communication device carried the same voice. From the admirals at Starfleet Command to the colonists on distant outposts, billions of beings heard the presence address them directly. You have built a civilization on a paradox. You value all life, yet you allow suffering you could prevent. You claim moral authority, yet you stand aside while civilizations destroy themselves. You speak of peace, yet you have fought wars that could have been avoided through earlier intervention. President Jaresinho stood, his voice steady despite the impossibility of what was occurring. We follow the Prime Directive to protect developing civilizations from cultural contamination. To allow each species the right to grow according to its own nature. A noble justification. Let US examine its truth. The Federation Council chamber dissolved, replaced by something else, not a place but a moment in time. Picard recognized it immediately, the observation of a pre-warp civilization on Mintaka 3, the moment when a cultural anthropology team had been accidentally exposed, nearly destroying the Mintakans' natural development. Here, the presence said, you enforced non-interference even as your presence threatened to transform their entire culture. You scrambled to undo damage while claiming to protect their development. But the damage was done. They had seen technology beyond their understanding. Their myths would forever carry the shadow of your intrusion. The scene shifted to the Borlans, whose planet's atmosphere was collapsing. Picard watched himself, or rather, watched the Federation debate whether to save a civilization of hundreds of thousands from extinction. The Prime Directive said no. Basic compassion said yes. In the end, a small group had been saved through deception, relocated to a similar planet while believing they had simply migrated. You saved some and let hundreds of thousands die, the presence observed. Not because saving them was impossible, but because your directive said it was forbidden. You possessed the power to prevent genocide, and you chose principle over life. Counselor Tlatrek spoke, her Vulcan logic cutting through the emotional weight. The Prime Directive exists because intervention creates dependency. If we save every civilization from every disaster, they never develop the resilience to save themselves. We would become not helpers but overlords, benevolent perhaps, but overlords nonetheless. Logical, the presence acknowledged. Yet incomplete. Observe. Another scene manifested, Baku, the planet where a Federation conspiracy had attempted to relocate a peaceful people to harvest their planet's metaphasic radiation. The Sona had been willing to commit genocide for immortality. The Federation had been complicit. Picard had been forced to choose between orders and ethics. You invoke the Prime Directive to justify non-intervention in natural development, the Presence said. Yet you violate it when strategic interests align with intervention. Your directive is not principle. It is convenience disguised as ethics. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Picard felt the weight of every decision he'd made, every time he'd bent or broken the Prime Directive when his conscience demanded it. The time he'd armed a primitive society to fight Cardassian oppression. The time he'd interfered to prevent cultural genocide. The countless small violations justified by circumstances. The Prime Directive is a guideline, Admiral Nechayev said sharply, not an absolute law. We apply it with discretion. Discretion, the Presence repeated. Meaning you apply it when convenient and ignore it when inconvenient. This is not principle. This is situational ethics pretending to be universal truth. The Federation Council chamber reformed around the delegates, but the Presence's light remained, casting everything in its revealing radiance. Picard found himself back in his ready room, but he could still sense the Presence's attention on the entire Federation, like a spotlight exposing every shadow. What do you want from us? President Tereshinyo demanded. You've shown us our contradictions. What would you have us do? Abandon the Prime Directive and become interventionists? Become the very thing we've spent centuries trying not to be? I want you to understand what you truly value, the Presence replied. The Klingon value honor but practice brutality. The Romulans value cunning but practice cowardice. The Borg value unity but practice tyranny. And you, Federation, value life but practice selective compassion. Because universal compassion is impossible, shouted the Tellarite counselor. We cannot save everyone. We cannot solve every problem. We must make choices, and the Prime Directive gives us a framework for those choices. A framework that allows you to feel righteous while innocents die, the Presence said, and the words carried no judgment, only observation, which somehow made them cut deeper. You watch civilizations collapse from orbit, your ships filled with medicine, food, technology that could save millions. And you do nothing. Not because intervention is impossible, but because your directive forbids it. Picard stood slowly, his voice carrying the weight of command experience. You're asking us to choose between two impossible positions. If we intervene constantly, we become oppressors who rob species of their autonomy. If we never intervene, we become monsters who value principles over lives. There is no perfect answer. Exactly. The word resonated through dimensions, and Picard suddenly understood. The Presence wasn't testing whether the Federation had the right answer. It was testing whether they understood that no right answer existed, and how they navigated that impossibility. The Klingon believe in simple truths, honor, glory, strength, the Presence continued. When confronted with complexity, they break. The Romulans believe in control through deception. When confronted with transparency, they shatter. The Borg believe in perfection through uniformity. When confronted with individual value, they fragment. But you, the Presence said, and now its attention focused solely on the Federation Council and Picard simultaneously, you have built your entire civilization on the acknowledgement of impossible choices. Your Prime Directive is not weakness. It is the recognition that power must be constrained by principle, even when that constraint causes suffering. You are not hypocrites for violating your own directive when conscience demands it. You are moral beings struggling with the reality that ethics and outcomes do not always align. The council chamber fell silent as the full weight of the Presence's words settled. It was not condemning the Federation. It was acknowledging the fundamental tragedy of moral action, that doing right often meant accepting terrible consequences, and that no principle could resolve every dilemma. Then what is our test? Picard asked quietly. Your test begins now, the Presence replied. I have destabilized the Klingon Empire, exposed the Romulan state, and fragmented the Borg Collective. 3 powers that have threatened you for centuries now stand at the brink of transformation or collapse. You possess the power to intervene, to stabilize the Klingon, to aid the Romulans, to guide the liberated Borg. But the Prime Directive says you must not. The trap closed with perfect clarity. The Presence had created a situation where intervention would violate the Federation's most sacred principle, but non-intervention would allow chaos, suffering, and potentially the collapse of galactic civilization. There was no correct answer, only choices, each with profound consequences. Choose, the presence said simply. And in choosing, reveal what you truly value when principle and compassion collide. The light faded, but the test remained. And the Federation, for the first time in its history, had to decide whether its founding principle was worth more than the lives it might cost to uphold. The Federation Council erupted into chaos the moment the presence withdrew. Delegates shouted over each other, voices rising in a cacophony of fear, anger, and desperate strategizing. President Gereshigno called for order repeatedly, his voice lost in the din until he activated the chamber's priority override, silencing all other speakers. Members of the council, he said, his voice strained but authoritative, we have been presented with an impossible choice deliberately designed to expose our contradictions. Before we make any decisions, we need information. Admiral Nechayev, what is the current status of the Klingon Empire, the Romulan Star Empire, and the Borg Collective? Nechayev's holographic form flickered as data streams updated behind her. The situation is deteriorating rapidly across all three powers. The Klingon High Council is deadlocked between traditionalists who want to purge the weakness, the presence exposed, and reformers arguing for philosophical re-evaluation. Chancellor Gowron is losing authority. We're seeing spontaneous outbreaks of violence across the Empire as competing houses interpret the presence's revelations differently. Conservative estimates suggest civil war within 72 hours if the current trajectory continues. She paused, consulting another readout. The Romulan situation is equally unstable. The Tal Shir's exposure has created a power vacuum. Every covert operation, every manipulation, every state secret was revealed simultaneously. The Romulan people are demanding accountability. The Praetor has declared martial law, but compliance is inconsistent. We're detecting signs of potential military coup from at least 3 different factions. And the Borg? Asked Ambassador Klatrek. The collective has fractured into multiple autonomous segments. Approximately 18% of all drones have fully regained individual consciousness, most are experiencing severe psychological trauma from decades or centuries of assimilation. Another 35% exist in hybrid states, partially connected to the collective but retaining individual awareness. The remaining drones are attempting to maintain the old order, but without consensus, their coordination is breaking down. Multiple cubes have gone dormant. Others are engaging in erratic behavior. And some, Nechayev's expression darkened. Some are continuing assimilation operations, but without central coordination, they're acting more like raiders than the methodical collective we knew. The implications were staggering. 3 of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations were simultaneously collapsing, each victim of the presence's surgical exposure of their foundational contradictions. And the Federation had the resources, the knowledge, and the capability to stabilize all 3, if they chose to intervene. Counselor Nayrok of Andoria spoke, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. The Prime Directive was written for pre-warp civilizations. None of these 3 powers are pre-warp. They're peer competitors who have threatened Federation security for decades. We have no legal obligation to stand aside. The principle behind the Prime Directive applies to all civilizations, countered Klatrek. Non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states is a cornerstone of interstellar law. If we intervene now, we establish a precedent that the Federation can violate sovereignty whenever we deem another power's internal situation threatens our interests. We become exactly what we've always claimed not to be, an interventionist empire. But this isn't an internal affair, argued the Tellarite counselor. The presence, an external entity, deliberately destabilized these civilizations. We wouldn't be interfering in natural development. We'd be responding to an attack. An attack that caused no physical harm, Klatrek responded. The presence used only truth as its weapon. If we consider truth to be an attack, we acknowledge that these civilizations were built on lies so fundamental that exposure to truth destroys them. Should we work to preserve comfortable lies? Aboard the Enterprise, Picard listened to the debate while studying sensor data from across the quadrant. Worf stood beside him, his expression torn between Starfleet duty and Klingon heritage. "Captain," Worf said quietly, "the presence showed my people uncomfortable truths about honor. But those truths did not account for the complexity of Klingon culture. The Romulans practice deception, but they have also preserved remarkable cultural achievements. The Borg pursue forced unity, but they have also protected countless assimilated consciousnesses from permanent death. The Federation violates its own Prime Directive, but we have also saved billions of lives and fostered unprecedented interstellar cooperation." "Truth is not binary," Counselor Troy added, joining the conversation. "The presence claims to reveal truth, but it's revealing only one dimension of truth, the dimension that serves its purpose. Whatever that purpose may be." Picard felt something shift in his understanding. The presence had presented itself as a neutral observer, a divine judge conducting impartial tests. But Data and Troy were right, there was nothing neutral about selectively exposing failures while ignoring successes. The presence was shaping perception, guiding civilizations toward specific conclusions. The question was, why? "Mr. Data," Picard said slowly, "you stated earlier that the presence exists in quantum superposition, simultaneously in multiple states. What if that's not just a description of its nature, but of its limitation?" "Clarification, Captain. The presence claims to be from another reality, another universe entirely. What if it doesn't fully understand our universe because it's not native to it? What if it's making the same mistake anthropologists sometimes make when encountering new cultures, judging them by external standards without understanding internal context?" Before Data could respond, the view screen activated, showing the Federation Council chamber. President Gerashino's face filled the screen, his expression grave. "Captain Picard, the Council has been debating for 6 hours. We're deadlocked. Half the Council wants to authorize humanitarian intervention in all 3 crises. The other half insists we maintain the principles of non-interference. We need perspective from someone who has directly engaged with the presence. What is your recommendation?" Picard stood silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of the question. Billions of lives hung in the balance. The future of galactic civilization depended on the choice the Federation made in the next hours. And he was being asked to be the deciding voice. "Mr. President," Picard began, choosing his words with extreme care, "I believe we are being presented with a false dilemma. The presence has framed this as a choice between principle and compassion, between the Prime Directive and humanitarian action. But that framing assumes the Prime Directive was designed to prevent us from helping civilizations in crisis. It was not." He gestured to Data to display historical records on a side screen. "The Prime Directive was created to prevent us from imposing our values, our technology, our culture on developing civilizations. It was designed to protect the weak from the strong. But the Klingon, Romulans, and Borg are not weak. They are pure civilizations capable of making their own choices. If they request aid, if they invite cooperation, then providing that aid is not interference, it is diplomacy. But they haven't requested aid," Counselor Nayrok protested. "The Klingon are too proud, the Romulans too paranoid, and the Borg too fragmented to form coherent requests. Then we offer," Picard said simply. "We don't impose. We don't dictate. We don't force our solutions on them. We offer humanitarian assistance, medical aid, diplomatic mediation, whatever they will accept. And if they refuse, we respect that refusal. That is not violation of the Prime Directive. That is upholding its spirit while acknowledging that rigid adherence to any principle in defiance of changing circumstances is not wisdom, it is dogma." Ambassador Tlatrek raised an eyebrow, the Vulcan equivalent of profound surprise. "You are suggesting we reinterpret the Prime Directive's application in real time, during a crisis, based on philosophical reasoning rather than established legal precedent?" "I am suggesting," Picard replied, "that the presence has given us an opportunity to examine whether we serve our principles or our principles serve us. The Prime Directive is a tool for ethical action, not a replacement for ethical thinking. We designed it to protect others from our power. If we now use it to justify inaction while others suffer, we have perverted its purpose. The council chamber fell silent as delegates absorbed his words. Finally, President Gereshino spoke. Captain, you're asking us to trust our judgment over our regulations. That's a dangerous precedent. Mr. President, with respect, we already do that. Every starship captain makes that choice regularly. I have violated the Prime Directive when conscience demanded it, as have hundreds of other officers. The difference is that we usually do so quietly, in the field, and justify it retroactively. What I'm suggesting is that we acknowledge openly what we already know, that no principle, however well-intentioned, can substitute for moral reasoning in complex situations. A new voice entered the conversation, not through the communication system, but manifesting directly in the council chamber and on the Enterprise simultaneously. The light returned, and with it, the presence's awareness. You have chosen to debate rather than act. Curious. We are not acting rashly, Picard said firmly. We are deliberating. That is how democracies function. While you deliberate, Klingon die in civil war. Romulans suffer under martial law. Liberated Borg drones experience psychological agony without treatment. Your principles allow you to feel thoughtful while others suffer. Then you understand nothing about moral action, Picard shot back, his voice hardening. Yes, we deliberate. Yes, we debate. Because hasty intervention based on good intentions has caused more suffering throughout history than careful inaction. You test us on our contradictions, but you ignore that acknowledging contradiction is the beginning of wisdom, not evidence of failure. The light pulsed, and Picard felt the full weight of the presence's attention focus on him with crushing intensity. You dare lecture me on wisdom? I dare question your methods, Picard said, refusing to back down. You claim to reveal truth, but truth without context is manipulation. You show us our failures but ignore our successes. You expose our contradictions but offer no path to resolution. You test us not to help us grow but to prove we are flawed. But all finite beings are flawed. That is the nature of existence. The question is not whether we are perfect, it is whether we strive for better despite our imperfections. The silence that followed was absolute. Every being in the Federation Council chamber, every crew member on the Enterprise, every citizen watching across Federation space held their breath, waiting to see how an omnipotent entity would respond to being challenged by a mortal captain. And then, for the first time, the presence's voice carried something that might have been amusement. Interesting. The presence's light shifted, its quality changing from the harsh illumination of judgment to something softer, more contemplative. Picard felt the oppressive weight of observation ease slightly, though the entity's awareness remained absolute. You challenge my methods, Jean-Luc Picard. You suggest that I, who exist beyond your comprehension, do not understand the nature of truth. Explain your reasoning. Picard took a breath, aware that he was navigating the most dangerous conversation of his life. You present yourself as omniscient, as the source of creation in your own reality. But you are not from our universe. You admitted as much. Which means, however vast your knowledge, you are interpreting our reality through the lens of your own. That is not objective observation, that is cultural bias on a cosmic scale. Elaborate. You showed the Klingon their failures of honor, but honor is not a simple binary concept in Klingon culture. It is complex, contextual, evolving. Yes, they have committed atrocities, but they have also developed sophisticated philosophical traditions around courage, loyalty, and personal integrity. By showing only the failures, you gave them an incomplete picture of themselves. Data stepped forward, his android confidence allowing him to join the debate without hesitation. The presence's methodology reveals a fundamental limitation. It observes from a position of absolute power, which means it cannot understand the perspective of finite beings making choices under constraint. An omniscient entity does not face genuine choice, it knows all outcomes. Therefore, it cannot truly comprehend moral decision-making, which requires acting despite uncertainty. You claim I lack understanding because I possess too much knowledge. The presence's tone carried genuine curiosity rather than offense. I claim you lack a specific type of understanding, Data replied. The understanding that comes from limitation, from mortality, from making choices that matter because they cannot be undone. You test finite beings using standards appropriate for infinite ones. That is not revelation, that is categorical error. Counselor Troy added her perspective, her empathic insights giving her unique authority. I sense your genuine desire to understand us. But understanding requires empathy, and empathy requires the ability to experience limitation. You show us our contradictions from outside, but you don't experience what it feels like to live within those contradictions. For us, contradiction is not failure, it is the texture of existence. We are simultaneously selfish and compassionate, logical and emotional, principled and pragmatic. That is not hypocrisy. That is complexity. The light pulsed again, and suddenly the Enterprise bridge transformed. Not physically, the structure remained unchanged, but overlaid upon it were visions of other moments, other choices, other versions of events that might have been. Picard saw himself making different decisions at critical moments, refusing to violate the Prime Directive at Mintaka 3, allowing the Mintakan's culture to collapse under the weight of divine revelation. Enforcing non-interference at Boral, watching an entire civilization die while he possessed the means to save them. Following orders at Baku, allowing the Sona to commit genocide for immortality. Each vision showed the consequences of strict adherence to principle without regard for context. And each consequence was horrific. I show you these alternatives to demonstrate the cost of your contradictions, the Presence said. You claim complexity justifies inconsistency. But inconsistent ethics lead to arbitrary outcomes. No, Picard said firmly, studying the alternative timelines. Rigid ethics lead to predictable outcomes, but predictability is not the same as justice. Look at those timelines. In every case where I followed principle without exception, innocent people suffered or died. Ethics without wisdom is not morality, it is abdication of moral responsibility disguised as virtue. The visions shifted, now showing alternative outcomes where Picard had intervened in every situation, imposing Federation solutions on every problem. These timelines showed different horrors, civilizations becoming dependent on Federation aid, losing the capacity for self-determination. Cultures flattened into homogeneity under Federation influence. Species that never developed resilience because the Federation solved all their problems. And here, the Presence said, you see the cost of unlimited intervention. Both extremes lead to suffering. Yet you claim your inconsistent middle path is superior. On what basis? On the basis that moral action requires judgment, not just principle, Picard replied. Yes, our approach is inconsistent. Yes, we sometimes intervene and sometimes don't, and reasonable people can disagree about which situations warrant which response. But that inconsistency reflects our acknowledgement that no single rule can address all situations justly. We maintain the Prime Directive as a guide, not a cage. We violate it when conscience demands, not because we are hypocrites, but because we are moral agents who understand that ethics is not a formula, it is a practice. The Presence fell silent, and in that silence, Picard sensed something unexpected. The entity was actually considering his words. Not dismissing them, not refuting them, but genuinely contemplating whether its omniscient perspective might have blind spots. Jean-Luc Picard, the Presence finally said, you are correct that I do not experience limitation. I observe your universe from outside its constraints. This gives me perspective you cannot achieve, but it also, the voice paused, perhaps for the first time experiencing something like uncertainty. It also prevents me from fully comprehending what it means to be bound by consequence. The admission sent shockwaves through everyone listening. An omnipotent entity acknowledging limitation, however small, was unprecedented. The Q continuum feared me because they could not comprehend me, the Presence continued. But perhaps I cannot fully comprehend you for similar reasons. You exist within time, within mortality, within uncertainty. These are not merely limitations, they are fundamental aspects of your mode of existence that shape how you perceive and interact with reality. Then perhaps, Picard said carefully, your tests have been asking the wrong questions. You sought to expose contradiction and hypocrisy. But what if contradiction is not a flaw to be corrected but a feature of finite existence? What if the ability to hold multiple truths in tension, to be both principled and pragmatic, both consistent and adaptable, is not weakness but sophisticated moral reasoning? The light expanded, filling not just the Enterprise but radiating across the entire Federation, the Klingon Empire, the Romulan Star Empire, and into the fragmented nodes of the Borg Collective. And in that expansion, something changed. The presence was no longer simply observing and judging. It was learning. You have shown me something unexpected, the presence said, its voice now carrying a quality of wonder. I came to test whether finite consciousness could be trusted with the tools of creation. I expected to find either noble savages worthy of protection or dangerous children requiring constraint. Instead, I find something more complex, beings who understand their own limitations and struggle to act ethically despite, or perhaps because of, those limitations. On the view screen, President Jerezinho spoke, his voice trembling slightly. Then, have we passed your test? You have revealed that my test was flawed, the presence replied. I sought simple answers to complex questions. I judged you for contradictions that may, in fact, be evidence of sophisticated moral reasoning rather than failure. But my intervention has caused real harm. The Klingon Empire burns. The Romulan state fractures. The Borg Collective suffers. These consequences are my responsibility. Picard felt a chill of realization. The presence was acknowledging fault, which meant it was capable of error. Which meant it was not truly omnipotent in the way it had presented itself. It was immensely powerful, perhaps beyond measure, but it operated within some framework of rules, some structure of existence that constrained even its vast capabilities. If you bear responsibility, Picard said, then you bear the obligation to address the harm you've caused. Agreed. But I cannot simply undo my revelations. Truth, once revealed, cannot be erased without violating the consciousness of those who perceived it. To erase memory of what has occurred would be to deny these civilizations agency over their own development. I would become the very thing I tested them for, an entity that imposes its will regardless of the rights of those affected. Then help us repair what's been broken, Picard urged. Not by imposing solutions, but by providing resources, knowledge, assistance to those who request it. You have immense power. Use it not to judge but to heal. The presence's light dimmed slightly, as though considering. This would require me to violate my position as observer. To become participant. To acknowledge that my presence here is not neutral but influential. That my very existence in your reality changes it. Then welcome to the moral complexity of being an actor in the universe rather than just an observer of it, Guinan said, speaking for the first time. She had been standing quietly in the corner of the bridge, but now she stepped forward, her ancient eyes meeting the light directly. I've lived long enough to know that power without engagement is cowardice dressed as wisdom. You wanted to test whether we were worthy of the tools of creation. But the real test is whether you're worthy of the power you wield. Will you use it responsibly? The silence that followed was profound. Picard could feel the presence wrestling with concepts that might be new to it. Culpability, moral obligation, the ethical responsibilities that come with power. For an entity that claimed to be the source of creation in its own realm, these might be entirely novel considerations. Finally, the presence spoke, and its voice carried a quality of humility that had not been present before. I will offer assistance to those who request it. I will not impose solutions, but I will provide resources for healing. The Klingon must decide their own future. The Romulans must navigate their own crisis. The Borg must determine what they will become. But I will ensure they have the capacity to make those choices without being destroyed by the crisis my intervention created. And the Federation? President Jerezinho asked. The Federation has taught me that judgment without understanding is arrogance, even for beings of vast power. You have passed no test because there was no test to pass, only a flawed examination conducted by an entity who did not fully understand what it was observing. For that, I apologize. The word sent shockwaves through every listener. An omnipotent entity apologizing to mortals was perhaps the most profound revelation of the entire encounter. But know this, the presence continued, its voice strengthening. You stand at a genuine threshold. Your species, your federation, your civilization is approaching a point of transformation. The choices you make in the coming years will determine not just your survival but your fundamental nature. I cannot tell you which path to choose. I can only tell you that the choice will come, and it will be irreversible. What kind of choice? Picard demanded. Whether to remain finite or transcend. Whether to stay bound by mortality and limitation or to evolve into something greater. Species before you have faced this threshold. Some chose transcendence and became like the Organians, beings of pure energy, powerful but detached from physical existence. Others chose to remain mortal, to preserve the struggles that give meaning to existence. Both paths have value. Both have cost. The revelation struck Picard with stunning force. The presence wasn't just testing current capabilities, it was evaluating whether humanity and the Federation were ready for a fundamental transformation of existence itself. The philosophical debates, the moral struggles, the contradictions they navigated daily, all of it was preparation for a choice that would define the species for eternity. When will this choice come? Riker asked. When you are ready. Or when you are forced. The universe does not wait for perfect preparedness. The light began to recede, pulling back from the Enterprise, from the Federation, from the galaxy itself. I came to judge and found myself judged. I came to test and found myself tested. Perhaps that is the nature of true omniscience, understanding that there is always more to understand. Will you return? Picard asked. Perhaps. But not as judge. If I return, it will be as observer who understands the limits of observation. You have reminded me of something I had forgotten, that wisdom is not just knowledge but the understanding of how and when to apply it. Live well, Federation. Klingon. Romulans. Borg. You have earned the right to choose your own futures. The light faded completely, and suddenly sensors confirmed what everyone already knew, the presence was gone. Not just from local space, but from the galaxy entirely. It had withdrawn to wherever omnipotent entities resided when they were not testing mortal civilizations. The Federation Council chamber remained silent for a long moment before erupting in chaos once more, but this time, it was the chaos of relief, of survival, of profound philosophical vertigo from an encounter that had shaken the foundations of everything they thought they understood about existence. Picard sank into his command chair, suddenly exhausted. Status report, he said quietly. Data worked his console. Captain, I am detecting that the crises in Klingon, Romulan, and Borg space have stabilized. Not resolved, but stabilized. It appears the presence has kept its word, it is providing resources for healing without imposing solutions. What kind of resources? Difficult to quantify. Klingon warriors are reporting sudden clarity of thought, ability to see past rage to possibility. Romulans are experiencing what their reports describe as enforced honesty, not inability to lie, but sudden awareness of the cost of deception. And the Borg, Data paused, his expression approaching wonder. The liberated drones are receiving what appears to be psychological support. Not from external sources, but as though the trauma of regaining consciousness is being buffered by some force we cannot measure. Healing without imposing, Troy said softly. It's keeping its promise. Worf stood at tactical, his expression conflicted. Captain, I am receiving a personal message from the Klingon High Council. Chancellor Gowron requests the Federation's assistance in mediating the philosophical crisis within the Empire. He says, He says that if the humans can challenge a god and teach it wisdom, perhaps they can help Klingon remember what honor truly means. Picard allowed himself a small smile. Inform the Chancellor that we would be honored to assist. But only if the Klingon Empire genuinely requests our help. We will not impose our presence. Aye, sir. As his crew worked to respond to the unfolding situation, Picard gazed out at the stars, thinking about thresholds and choices and the profound responsibility of existence. The presence had come seeking to judge them and had instead learned from them. It had tested their contradictions and discovered that contradiction itself was a sophisticated response to complexity. But its warning about an approaching threshold lingered. Humanity and the Federation would someday face a choice about what they would become. Would they transcend mortality and limitation, becoming beings of pure consciousness? Or would they remain mortal, accepting the suffering and beauty that came with finite existence? The answer, Picard knew, would define not just humanity but the fundamental meaning of what it meant to be alive. 3 months after the Presence's departure, the galaxy was still reverberating with the consequences of its intervention. The Enterprise orbited Earth, having been recalled to Starfleet headquarters for the most significant diplomatic summit in Federation history. Representatives from the Klingon Empire, the Romulan Star Empire, and even a delegation of liberated Borg drones had gathered to discuss the future of galactic civilization. Picard stood in the observation lounge of the newly constructed summit hall, watching the delegates arrive via transporter and shuttle. The scene would have been unthinkable 4 months ago. Klingon, Romulans, Federation officials, and former Borg drones sharing space without weapons drawn, engaging in genuine dialogue rather than diplomatic posturing. Chancellor Gowron approached, his bearing still proud but tempered by something that might have been wisdom. The Klingon leader had survived the philosophical crisis within his empire, but barely. The traditionalists had nearly overthrown him before a coalition of reformers, warriors who had taken the Presence's revelations seriously, had rallied to his defense. Captain Picard, Gowron said, offering the Klingon salute. Your presence at these talks has been educational. Chancellor, Picard replied. I understand the Empire has been undergoing significant reforms. Reforms. Gowron's laugh was bitter but genuine. We have been forced to confront what honor means when tested by something that cannot be fought. Many of my people wanted to reject the Presence's revelations entirely, to call them lies from a demon or trickster. But others, younger warriors, mostly, asked why we feared examining ourselves. If our honor is true, they argued, then it should withstand scrutiny. And what conclusion have they reached? That honor is not a simple code to be followed blindly, but a practice to be cultivated with wisdom. That strength without purpose is just violence. That dying well matters less than living well. Gowron met Picard's eyes. These are not easy truths for Klingon to accept. But the Presence showed us the cost of refusing to accept them. Civil war. Stagnation. Becoming a caricature of ourselves. Before Picard could respond, Admiral Mendak of the Tal Shiar, or rather, former Tal Shiar, joined them. The Romulan intelligence apparatus had been dissolved in the wake of total exposure, replaced by a new agency operating with unprecedented transparency. Mendak had been among those who argued for the change, recognizing that the old ways had led only to isolation and paranoia. Captain, Chancellor, Mendak greeted them with formal courtesy. I trust the summit preparations are proceeding smoothly. As smoothly as can be expected when former enemies attempt cooperation, Picard said diplomatically. Former enemies. Mendak considered the phrase. Perhaps that is optimistic. But the Presence taught us that deception has costs we had not fully calculated. The Romulan people now know every manipulation, every secret assassination, every false flag operation conducted in their name. The Praetor fell within a week of that revelation. The new government operates under what we are calling enforced accountability, not from external observers, but from our own citizens, who now demand truth from their leaders. A difficult transition, Gowron observed. Painful, Mendak agreed. But perhaps necessary. We built our civilization on secrets, and secrets became our prison. Breaking free has been agonizing, but there is a certain liberation in no longer maintaining elaborate lies. Our resources are no longer consumed by internal surveillance and manipulation. We can invest them in other pursuits. Such as? Picard asked. Exploration. Science. Art. The things we abandoned in favor of survival through cunning. Mendak's expression softened slightly. The presence showed us what we had given up in exchange for security. Perhaps it is time to reclaim some of that. A new figure approached, 7 of 9, the former Borg drone who had been liberated years ago aboard Voyager and had become an advocate for the newly freed drones. She moved with precise efficiency, her Borg implant still visible but integrated into her identity rather than controlling it. Captain Picard, she said, her tone carrying warmth that would have been impossible when she was fully Borg. The delegation is ready to present our proposal. How are the liberated drones adjusting? Picard asked with genuine concern. With difficulty. Decades or centuries of collective consciousness cannot be easily replaced with individual identity. Many are experiencing profound psychological trauma. Some have requested reassimilation to escape the pain of individuality. Others are embracing freedom despite the suffering it brings. 7 paused. The collective itself is changing. The remaining drones have begun questioning their purpose. Without the certainty of forced unity, they must choose unity. And choice changes everything. Will the collective survive? Mendak asked. In some form. But it will not be the Borg we knew. The drones who remain connected are exploring what voluntary cooperation might look like. They're asking questions that were previously forbidden. Why do we assimilate? What is perfection? Can unity be achieved without force? These questions may destroy them, or they may transform them into something unprecedented. The summit bell chimed, calling the delegates to the main chamber. Picard, Gowron, Mendak, and 7 of 9 made their way to the vast circular hall where hundreds of representatives waited. At the center stood President Tereshinyo and a holographic representation of the Borg consensus, not a queen, but a collective voice representing thousands of drones engaging in genuine democratic process. Tereshinyo called the summit to order. 3 months ago, an entity calling itself the Presence entered our galaxy and tested our civilizations. It showed us our contradictions, our failures, our hypocrisies. Many of us wanted to reject its revelations as attacks or deceptions. But Captain Picard of the Enterprise helped us understand that the Presence, despite its vast power, was not infallible. It brought its own biases, its own limitations. The President gestured to Picard, who stood. The Presence tested us, but we also tested it. We showed it that finite beings, operating within limitation and mortality, have developed moral sophistication precisely because we must make choices without perfect knowledge. We taught an omnipotent entity that power without wisdom is not superiority, it is abdication of genuine understanding. Picard's words echoed through the chamber, carried by universal translators into hundreds of languages. But the Presence also gave us a warning. It told us that our civilizations, all of us, not just the Federation, stand at a threshold. A moment of transformation that will define what we become. We don't know exactly what that threshold is, or when we'll reach it. But we know that how we respond to it will matter more than any choice we've made before. Gowron stood, his voice carrying the authority of the Klingon Empire. The Presence showed my people that strength without wisdom is brutality. We are Klingon, we will always value courage, honor, combat. But we now understand that these values must be in service to something greater than mere violence. We propose a new era of engagement with the Federation and other powers. Not alliance, Klingon bow to no one. But cooperation between equals who recognize each other's worth. Mendak rose next. The Romulan Star Empire has operated in shadows for centuries. The Presence exposed those shadows to harsh light. Our new government commits to a policy of strategic transparency, not naivete, but acknowledgement that deception has costs that outweigh its benefits. We propose intelligence sharing agreements, joint scientific endeavors, and cultural exchanges that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. 7 of 9 spoke for the liberated Borg. The collective sought perfection through forced unity. The presence showed us that forced anything is tyranny, not perfection. Those of us who have regained individuality are exploring what voluntary cooperation can achieve. We do not seek to rejoin the Federation or any existing power structure. But we wish to establish diplomatic relations and contribute our knowledge to galactic civilization. We have assimilated the experiences of thousands of species. That knowledge, freely shared rather than forcibly taken, could benefit all. The proposals were revolutionary. Natural enemies contemplating cooperation. Civilizations built on contradictory principles finding common ground. It was not unity, each power retained its distinct identity and values. But it was recognition that coexistence required more than simply avoiding war. It required genuine engagement with perspectives fundamentally different from one's own. President Tereshinho brought the session to a formal vote. The Federation Council overwhelmingly approved the framework for expanded cooperation. The Klingon delegation roared their approval in traditional fashion. The Romulans indicated assent with characteristic reserve. And the liberated Borg consensus signaled agreement through their holographic interface. As the chamber erupted in cautious celebration, Picard felt a familiar presence beside him. He turned to find Q, looking uncharacteristically serious. "I suppose you're here to say, 'I told you so,'" Picard said dryly. "Actually, no." Q's tone lacked its usual mockery. "The Continuum has been watching what happened. We're impressed. And confused. And more than a little disturbed." "Why disturbed?" "Because you did something we thought impossible, Picard. You encountered an entity more powerful than us, an entity that could neutralize Q with a thought, and you taught it humility. You, a mortal who will be dust in a cosmic eye blink, educated something approaching the divine. That's either the most arrogant thing any species has ever done, or the most profound. The Continuum hasn't decided which. Perhaps it's both," Picard suggested. "Perhaps." Q looked around the summit hall, watching former enemies engage in genuine dialogue. The presence changed something fundamental in this galaxy. It exposed contradictions, yes, but in doing so, it forced everyone to confront whether those contradictions were failures or features. And you, infuriating, persistent humanity, you convinced it that finite beings have wisdom that infinite beings lack. "The wisdom of limitation," Picard said. "When you can't know everything, can't do everything, can't undo your mistakes, you develop careful judgment. You learn to act despite uncertainty. That's not inferior to omniscience, it's a different kind of knowledge." Q actually smiled, and it was genuine. "The Continuum has decided something, Picard. We're going to step back. Not withdraw entirely, but stop interfering so much in mortal affairs. The presence showed us that even vast power doesn't guarantee understanding. Perhaps it's time we let you stumble forward without our constant testing. Will we see you again?" "Oh, undoubtedly. I can't resist checking in on humanity's progress. But less frequently, and with less judgment." Q's expression turned serious. "The presence wasn't wrong about the threshold, you know. Humanity is approaching something significant. A transformation that will define your species for eternity. When that moment comes, Picard, the choice will be yours alone. Not ours. Not the presence's. Yours." Before Picard could respond, Q vanished in his characteristic flash of light. Later, as the summit concluded its first day, Picard stood in the observation lounge with his senior staff, watching the sunset over San Francisco Bay. Earth, humanity's cradle, spinning peacefully beneath a diplomatic gathering that would have seemed impossible only months ago. "Do you think the presence will return?" Riker asked. "I don't know," Picard admitted. "But I think it got what it came for, not validation of its assumptions, but challenge to them. It wanted to test whether finite consciousness could be trusted with great power. Instead, it learned that finite consciousness has insights that infinite consciousness lacks. The question remains, Data said, what threshold lies ahead? What transformation is approaching that will require us to choose what we become? We'll face that when we must, Picard replied. For now, we do what we've always done, explore, learn, strive to be better than we were yesterday. The presence tested our contradictions and found them to be not weaknesses but adaptations. We are not perfect. We will never be perfect. But we are committed to growth, to improvement, to navigating moral complexity with wisdom rather than dogma. Troy smiled. The galaxy has changed. Not just politically, but philosophically. Every civilization that encountered the presence has been forced to examine its fundamental assumptions. Some will collapse under that examination. Others will evolve. And we will do what the Federation has always done, Picard said, raising his glass of wine in a quiet toast. We will help those who request it, respect those who refuse it, and navigate the impossible space between principle and pragmatism with the best judgment we can muster. His crew raised their glasses in response, a silent acknowledgement of the burden and privilege of existence. To be finite. To be mortal. To make choices that mattered because they could not be undone. To struggle with contradiction not as failure but as the texture of meaningful life. Somewhere beyond the boundaries of perception, in dimensions the Federation could not measure and might never reach, the presence observed. It had come to judge and found itself judged. It had come to test and found itself tested. And in that reversal, it had learned what omniscience could never teach, that wisdom is not just knowledge, but the humility to recognize the limits of one's own perspective. The galaxy turned. Civilizations rose and fell. Species evolved or went extinct. And finite beings, aware of their limitations and determined to transcend them through effort rather than power, continued their stumbling journey toward understanding. The threshold would come. The choice would be made. But not today. Today, there was only the work of building something better from the ruins of old certainties. The work of recognizing that perfection was not the absence of contradiction but the wisdom to navigate it. The work of being alive, finite, flawed, and striving despite, or because of, those limitations. And in that work, perhaps, lay something approaching the divine. The presence had entered the Star Trek universe seeking answers to a fundamental question: could finite consciousness be trusted with the tools of creation? It had tested the Klingon on their commitment to honor, exposing the brutality beneath their noble rhetoric. It had tested the Romulans on their reliance on deception, revealing the prison their secrets had become. It had tested the Borg on their pursuit of perfection, demonstrating that forced unity was tyranny rather than harmony. And it had tested the Federation on their most sacred principle, the Prime Directive that balanced non-interference with moral responsibility. But in testing the Federation, the presence encountered something unexpected: beings who understood that contradiction was not weakness but sophistication. Mortals who recognized that no principle, however noble, could substitute for genuine moral reasoning in complex situations. Captain Jean-Luc Picard had done what few beings in any universe had managed: he had challenged an omnipotent entity and taught it humility. He had shown the presence that omniscience without context is manipulation, that power without wisdom is abdication, and that finite beings possess insights that infinite consciousness cannot achieve. The presence withdrew, not in defeat but in recognition that it had come seeking to judge and had instead been educated. It left the galaxy changed, civilizations forced to confront their foundational contradictions, enemies tentatively exploring cooperation, and the entire framework of galactic politics restructured around new philosophical understanding. But it also left a warning: a threshold approached. A moment when the Federation, humanity, and perhaps all conscious beings in the galaxy would face a choice about what they would become. Whether to transcend mortality and limitation, evolving into beings of pure consciousness, or to remain finite, accepting the suffering and beauty that came with corporeal existence. That choice would define them for eternity. And when it came, they would face it not with perfect knowledge or unlimited power, but with the same flawed wisdom that had allowed them to teach a god the meaning of humility, the understanding that limitation itself was not weakness but the foundation of genuine moral action. The presence had entered their universe testing whether finite beings deserved power. It departed having learned that finite beings possessed something infinite consciousness could never achieve, the wisdom born of choice made despite uncertainty, the courage born of mortality, and the meaning born of struggle. In challenging the divine, the Federation had not proven themselves perfect. They had proven themselves worthy, not of omnipotence, but of the harder, nobler task of striving toward better despite their limitations. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson the galaxy had learned, that the measure of consciousness was not power or perfection, but the commitment to growth in the face of inevitable imperfection. The stars waited. The threshold approached. And finite beings, aware of their mortality and determined to matter despite it, continued their journey into the unknown.